The repair shop was the most a place with an endearing television program where shattered heirlooms were returned to life and the memories they have with them transported, but what if that kind there were calming tones and smiles? Story that no one anticipated, a tale of trauma, calm, and silence finding the solution to this terrible secret. Didn't just one life was subtly altered. The show indefinitely, and finally it contributed to the emotional collapse of the actual repair shop. What actually took place behind those barn doors? It's not excellent, though, and by the time watch this video. Why the barn that made the repairs initially broken? The repair shop didn't appear to be the type of program that would cause a shift in culture there. There were no dramatic lights or flashing lights, music cues and, most definitely, no pre-written conflicts. What it provided instead was something that had mysteriously disappeared from contemporary television: real people bonding in a peaceful Sussex barn loaded with vintage implements and organic light. A group of skilled artisans labored quietly and calmly to bring broken. Every item is brought back to life by heirlooms. Told a tale in addition to the product itself, but also regarding the individuals connected to. A youngster was once soothed by a music box. To put to sleep a clock that was previously in a teddy bear in a grandfather's kitchen sewn together by a deceased father. These were not merely fixes, they were emotional archaeology activities that reveal layers of trauma, love, memory, and legacy. And this might have been the key. A key component of the show's popularity is didn't act as though life was flawless or that destruction was actually quite shameful. Depended on the notion that items and people could have scars or even broken and yet remain beautiful once more. The barn was energized by that spirit. Each has its own workshop section. People in the sanctuary sobbed there, not just both the visitors and the specialists. There was the place has a hallowed quality, although there was something invisible behind that warmth. Restoring emotional weight isn't just concerning the item on the table, enduring the sorrow of another long enough to assist them in letting go of that day in and day out while being watched by cameras gradually exhausts the viewership. Admired the show's spirit, but what they failed to notice was that the soul needed to originate somewhere from individuals who frequently provided more than was necessary, and few of those individuals carried as much. Susie Fletcher's modest emotional weight, a lady whose tale would soon come to light that occasionally even healers require recovery. When Susie Fletcher shows up in silence. When Susie Fletcher initially in 2018, she showed up to the repair business. Didn't arrive with much fanfare or hey, she just entered. She pulled up her leather tools from the barn and went to work. She had a sense of stability and instant serenity that gave her the impression that she was there no matter what, even if we'd only recently met her. Yet the majority of viewers couldn't possibly know and didn't know was that she had come because of a quietly torn life. Susie has recently returned to the UK. After years of living overseas, her spouse Rob passed away due to pancreatic cancer. Is sufficient to ruin a life on its own. But for Susie's coming home was about more than mourning. It meant beginning anew from the remnants of something much greater, more intricate than anyone could perceive. She was hesitant to appear on camera, but not because timidity, but due to her emotional. The final thing was a depleted television. She didn't want to be seen by anyone. She desired a pattern of calm, perhaps even being invisible. Steve Fletcher, her brother, was there. Already a show fan favorite who urged her after noticing something she not yet able to recognize in herself, and she finally consented to join warily. Silently, as if someone were dipping their toe into uncharted territory following a storm. Her job as a leather worker and saddler expert was a fantastic fit for her. The work was rhythmic, sensuous, and subtly demanding. It allowed her to concentrate on something other than in a way that is both distracting and grounded. She didn't have to give an explanation to the audience or excessively divulge. Her tools spoke for her. Her workmanship was exceptional. sort of discussion that didn't need words that viewers answered immediately demonstrating her sincerity. She turned into the quiet in the middle of the storm, a person who paid more attention than she. He spoke with a kind of reverence to each fix she worked on, yet the outcome wasn't merely a professional one. Was reconstructing her personal survival. Piece by piece, something of her own, and despite the fact that she hardly mentioned it Susie wasn't simply going back to she was going back to the UK. The Saddler herself, with a secret over the course of the seasons, and Susie Fletcher's appearance on the program turned into she continued to be much more adored. Her attention and kindness were sincere and intimate. Obvious, but her private life, unlike many public celebrities, they remained steadfast. She wasn't enigmatic in the shadows by design, she just had an air of somewhat subdued dignity, yet concealing that gentleness had a far longer story to tell. More eerie than anybody knew that Susie decided to talk in 2023. For the first time in public about what in her marriage, she had not only the death of her spouse from cancer, but she endured years of intimate assault. Hidden in quiet during interviews and in her memoir, she eventually disclosed that Rob, her spouse, had been physically and emotionally unstable, abused. In a single terrifying memory she talked about how violently she was choked. That she sincerely thought her existence was she resided in a state for more than 15 years of psychological survival. The man she loved, one's personal tragedy, demons, his early years, which never recovered, and that eventually, the anguish spread outward, but like Susie stayed silent about the large number of survivors. Not because of a lack of faith, but because when you're in it for that long in particular, silence is frequently more secure than exposure. You get the ability to adjust to endure. Her husband's death in 2013 was a complicated loss, and certainly, there was grief, as well as a sort of release that is followed by a wave of remorse that frequently follows the termination of a violent partnership. Who do you lament, the individual they were or the person you were hoping they would be? And this is where things get even more. By the time Susie joined the group, it had become this trauma hadn't been repaired by the shop. Processed, it had been. She'd compartmentalized it and stored it. Similar to an old suitcase that keeps it out of sight, but not without thought. Her choice to discuss it in public 10 years later, it wasn't merely catharsis. Was enlightening for those who had observed her, providing consolation to others. The woman who was assisting was shocked by the truth. Everyone else had been quietly healing, broke the barn and herself as the way it had been healing was only one aspect of it. Of her recuperation, the remaining portion was still awaiting. Stated on television that they were healing off of it. There is a paradox of sorts that exists, and they can be seen on shows like The Repair Shop. This soft transitional area isn't exactly real-life documentaries that aren't quite fiction. Individuals recollect poignant situations under the gentle radiance of the camera lights, and for someone who sets things up, like Susie Fletcher, become a help and a hindrance to camera. She was calm, collected, and kind. Of someone you would naturally trust. Fragile object, whether it was a century-old saddle or your early years memories. But what the audience was unable to see was the manner in which the atmosphere that the program promoted, emotional transparency, frequently reflected her own unspoken grief, was more than simply a job at the farm. For Susie, her work served as a kind of therapy. A means to transform her suffering into something accurate and beneficial. Repetition of her work, the tactile, measured stitching sensation of tattered leather beneath her palms, turned into a kind of emotional rules for trauma survivors. That routine can seem like oxygen, but there were also guests on the other side. Would enter with hopeful hands and big eyes. Shuddering as they crossed their family heirlooms, they would sob. Would chuckle and exchange tales of survival and loss, and Susie Evergrace would occasionally listen. Nod subtly. At other occasions, she would provide kind words, but generally speaking she would take in their feelings like a sponge, displaying compassion without ever unloading her own narrative. Co-workers Richard Biggs was Impressed by her strength, even once made a joke about how much he liked her, but there was a profound comprehension underneath the hilarity. Nobody realized how much more Susie was carrying. She was the silent anchor of the barn. The individual who offered assistance to everyone else, but never requesting anything in exchange, yet she is emotional work, particularly that which is invisible is not overlooked by the body, it contributes even the most hardy over time. People start to perceive the fundamental flaws that Susie was fixing items captured on camera, but she was gradually coming to the realization that perhaps it was time to begin healing herself as soon as the mask. There's something strong about slipping. A reserved individual at last deciding to talk. Susie Fletcher kept her history private for years. Nestled away but not obscured by humiliation, but it sealed the road for you to close in very painful box. She had done what many survivors had done by reopening. Did she base her existence on strength? About sticking and being valuable? Hectic, working in the repair company. That strategy had worked well for her, but even the most robust scaffolding cannot support. In 2023, Susie let her go forever. The Sun Over the Mountains, a memoir. The title alone seemed to convey a message. Had been gloom, but the narrative was regarding the return trip to light. What was more than just a recounting of it was a silent act of rebellion, a reclaiming. She described the anxiety, that bewilderment, and the lengthy lifespan in continual terror. She explained the choking incident depicted in horrific detail, stating, "I genuinely believed I was going to pass away." The matter was gently conveyed in that statement. Actually fell like a thump for many fans. It was their first time. They became aware of how much she had endured while seeming so at ease. That written with such gentleness, yet this chapter in shock value wasn't the focus of her existence. It was regarding closure. She wrote the book technique to sew herself back together, not using thread or leather, but using reality. She went on to explain the writing process as a cathartic release method. She didn't realize she required till the words started to flow, explaining what makes this part of her narrative so profound. It redesigned each previous episode, now looking many scenes in which she listened softly to a visitor's tale. The tears she blinked back, the quiet that had been between her words. Spectators started to understand she wasn't merely showing sympathy. She was silently and intimately connecting. The mask hadn't suddenly cracked, had softly crept in her own time, and it did not destroy our perception of her was enhanced and provided it was emotional but real because of its weight. Sincerity has a cascading effect, and after her the world was aware of the story. That balance that she had discovered in the barn started to change. The emotional, the repair shop's toll was consistently higher. Compared to a television set for the employees, it was an emotional living entity. Ecology, it's simple to overlook that while as the music played, the cameras rolled, expanded, and as the adjustments were tied, closing with an optimistic bow. The inside the barn, visitors were taking an enormous emotional burden on. Each object arrived enveloped in that workshop in layers of pain and longing for memories. A hand-carved toy made its way across generations, a ticking, broken clock over a marriage's years, a faded picture that is included into a music box. These were more than just items. They were memory as well as memory vessels. Whoever has experienced loss knows how to weigh. For Susie and the others, more than stone, it wasn't just about the cast. It was about repairing these things, preserving the emotional room for the individuals who brought them in to hear. Describe your mother's final moments. Days to listen to a child's voice quiver when discussing a deceased grandparent, and then go back to your desk and thread through that feeling with silence. Hands, which is not an ability, that's emotional work, and it's frequently the days of invisible filming were lengthy. Visitors, experts on set occasionally shed tears as well. Rarely depicted were instances where the emotions caused the work to pause, became excessively raw in the room. Even the most stoic and resilient specialists had their breaking moments, but despite everything, the barn, there was no space for calm and tranquility. The work had to continue despite the emotional release. Susie in particular appeared to be carrying more in many respects. She had become more than most. The team's emotional fulcrum is her silence wasn't empty. Rather, it was she was able to accommodate other people's tales that gave them a sense of security. But when it's always you who makes room for those that are making room for you, that an unsaid query lingered in the background. And gradually it began to appear not in tantrums or breakdowns, but in burnout, fatigue, and quiet withdrawal. The show remained unchanged on the within the barn, but outside, a slow emotional exhaustion had started to set in. And that emotional burden was just as getting more difficult to convey. A louder disturbance slammed into the realm of the repair store during the storm. After declining until 2024, Blades was the face of the untouchable repair shop, the mentor's voice, the friendly presence that greeted visitors and connected viewers. Trusted him in each story collectively. They perceived him as somewhat sentimental interpreter who could speak on behalf of both the specialists and visitors, who might move between artistry and link. But the headlines followed. At first, the details were unclear, but then Jay had been charged with sharpening. Details are still being worked out, and all of a sudden the show's overall tone altered. The BBC reacted quickly, with programs being postponed, withdrawn trips, and in the public's trust in this was only about legal issues. The breakdown of the symbolic J from Foundation wasn't only the host, he was the man standing, the voice of the barn, told us in the doorway a week later. Week where each item has a backstory, and when the scandal changed his story instead of genuineness, the audience sensed a betrayal of tone as well as of trust. Suddenly, the emotionally reserved, the repair shop's rich world had a shadow. It for a person such as Susie, already standing on a delicate emotional ground, this wasn't simply negative publicity. The barn was becoming unstable. Her haven, a place of safety she could trust, continuing to be reliable, and even that wasn't immune, according to insiders. The show was slowed down by a decline in morale. Was characterized by emotional openness, was now mired in rumors and quiet and pain, as well as the fissures that had already started to demonstrate that they began to expand. Nevertheless, the most telling aspect wasn't the scandal itself, was the manner in which the show, in response, the BBC played it down, delayed things, and refrained from making straightforward remarks. Jay wasn't the only one to back off. Was clarity, honesty, two characteristics that have characterized the barn for years before the storm came, and whether anyone acknowledged it or not caused harm behind the workshop's cracks. Following the public moved on and the headlines faded. The repair shop is the next big story. Didn't collapse and disappear there. There were no last episodes or cancellations. Farewells rather than something more subdued. Something quieter occurred throughout the show. Started reducing. The number of tour dates that had sold out in a matter of minutes were now delayed or subtly reduced. Still included our promotional posters. Fans started to see familiar faces. That a few of those individuals, particularly in reality, Susie Fletcher, wasn't. Growing number of social media accounts, fewer active comments from viewers who are devoted, began posing the same query, where is everyone, although there was a smaller actual shift. About attendance and energy in particular, something felt weird in the barn. The intangible had lost that feeling of soothe, the sensation of being encased in a cozy blanket of emotion. It wasn't as no longer there, and the audience, even if they were unable to fully describe how it felt. Internal sources indicated that it was tired. Was intensifying. The emotional intensity, once a strength of the show, had turned into a somewhat slowly burning. Experts in liability were exhausted. Narratives were starting to blend together. The formula's simplicity makes it lovely. Began to feel tense, and at the most obvious in the middle of it all, Susie was not present. She hadn't made a there was no farewell moment at the public exit. However, she had left, and her absence was felt. She had been the most vocal of all the Scandals. Emotional center that isn't ostentatious or noisy, but stable, yet something had changed without her. It felt like taking the burden off of the BBC was the pendulum whose balance was off. Attempted to keep the barn looking like remained upright and the lights remained on, but it started to feel more and more like a museum showcasing the show's former state as a thriving, breathing area of communication, but a recreation of one, and everything that was occurring without someone fully saying it aloud, but the quiet that was directing Susie to take a step back wasn't even an official headline. Declaration, but it was concealed, and she hasn't done anything for what's obvious a year in which a simple comment from a fellow Richard Biggs, a repair shop expert, didn't appear to be meant to create a stir, but for devotees when you paid close attention. It landed like a slow movement. The quiet heart of Shockwave. Susie Fletcher of the program hadn't made an appearance in any episode without being on TV for more than a year. No send-off, no BBC statement, farewell montage featuring mellow music, and a tender voiceover, simply being completely absent, and that absence reverberated for a while. Her presence had gone unnoticed by viewers. Always been subdued and never looked for the spotlight, but the more time she spent away the barn became more visible. Was different, the tone had changed. Sentimental binding agent that had previously the stories from the workshop felt weaker now. Delicate, so why did she depart? Not a controversy per se, but a woman who had possibly sacrificed everything she had for Susie has dedicated years of her life to the barn's emotional effort of assistance others repair their mementos while discreetly bearing her personal history of trauma, mourning, and surviving, and perhaps just perhaps she knew it was time to stop becoming everyone else's caregiver and begin looking for oneself. There's something incredibly human about that kind of departure, not spectacular, not dramatic, just a silent line established by someone who realized what she needed at last. But the choice to leave didn't only have an impact in her personal story, it was a pivotal moment. For the actual performance, with Suze's silence, something crucial slipped during departure. Not a decline in ratings through the cracks, not a financial concern, but something more, something intangible that is more difficult to replace. The calm, steady essence of the barn at its core. Empathy had started to by now fade. The mirror and the memoir. The narrative of Susie Fletcher had assumed its own existence. The Sun Over the Mountains was a novel, but it was also a one mirror that did more than merely reflect her narrative, but reflected all of the spectators believed they were aware of the repair shop. Susie described her adventure on its pages. From an abusive marriage's trauma to the gradual emotional she